presentation will be available on YouTube at a later date. So you'll see a note about that right now. And then as we go through the presentation, please remain muted until the end. And if you have a question, you will have an opportunity during the question and answer session at the end. You're also more than welcome to type questions into the chat at any time, and we'll get to as many questions as possible. Today's Lunch and Learn is also going to be offering a 1-hour AIA and APA continuing education credit. All AIA members, please put your name and AIA member number in the chat before the presentation ends to receive attendance credit. APA members are to self-report within 48 hours of attendance to receive credit. Larry will put the event ID number in the chat for you all, along with his email address if you have any other credit questions. March is one of my favorite months. March is Florida Archaeology Month and Women's History Month. And I've been very fortunate to get to know many wonderful women archaeologists throughout my career. And our presenter today is one of those wonderful, amazing woman archaeologists I've been lucky enough to know. Dr. Mary Minkoff is the Executive Director of the Florida Public Archaeology Network, also known as FPAN. And there she oversees a network of regional centers dedicated to promoting stewardship, public appreciation, and the value of Florida's archaeological heritage through community engagement. Really, Mary has returned to FPAN as she was the outreach coordinator, the first outreach coordinator for the Northwest Regional Office. Since then, she's served as the Assistant Director of Archaeology and Curator of Archaeological Collections at James Madison's Montpelier. She worked with the National Park Service in a variety of areas, including the National Capital Regional Archaeology Office, and an archaeologist for the Urban Archaeology Corps Youth Program. She earned her PhD at the University of Maryland, College Park, her master's in historical archaeology from the University of West Florida, go Argos, and her BA in anthropology and history from the University of Mississippi. Now, we are so happy to have her back in Florida and leading FPAN. So I'm going to go ahead and have Mary take it away.
Awesome. Thank you, Mercedes. And it's so fun to be back in Florida and reconnect with fellow UWF grads, and even if we're doing it remotely. So I was really excited to be invited to do this presentation and, of course, share as part of Florida Archaeology Month. So I am going to share my screen. Give me just 1 second. There we go. 22. All right. So hopefully you all can see that as we go through. So I wanted to talk a little bit about archaeology, what it does, what it doesn't do, and particularly archaeological resources. So what are archaeological resources? I think of archaeological resources as falling into 4 major categories: landscapes, sites, features, and artifacts. I think sites and artifacts are probably the ones folks are most familiar with, but all of 4 of these are really important, and they work in connection to help us tell a more complete story of the past. So here's some examples of archaeological resources that you can see here. Sometimes they're underwater, sometimes they're quite small, like a very small archaeological artifact, or quite large, like a landscape. So some examples of archaeological landscapes, if you think about any type of historic landscape, it's that combination of everything together. So it can incorporate standing structures, it can incorporate features on land and underwater. So looking at this image here in the bottom right, that is a picture from the Jupiter Lighthouse Inlet in Jupiter, Florida. So you have a combination of historic and archaeological resources all on this site. You have the lighthouse itself, then you have the in the back, then you see those white buildings in front of it associated with the Coast Guard occupation of the site that are now used as offices. What you see in the front, sort of the foreground, are students learning how to document changing shorelines. So there's archaeological resources there associated with the inlet itself, but also features under the water. There's also a pre-contact native midden site at the Jupiter Lighthouse, as well as lots of other historic period occupations. Above that, you can see an archaeology kayak tour. So again, that combination, particularly in Florida, of the water features, what's on the land, what's below the land, what is still standing, what is not. And then of course, the large picture is Crystal River. So going up the mound sites, but all of these things working together create this archaeological landscape. So the standing structures and the things below the surface, both below the surface of the ground and below the surface of the water. So examples of archaeological sites may feel a little bit more familiar, but there's lots of different types of archaeological sites. But anywhere a person lived, worked, traveled, experienced life on land or on water could be an archaeological site. So of course, burial sites and cemeteries are some of the ones we think of the most. But of course, house sites and other residences from all time periods where people lived. Where people did business, so trading posts, taverns, hotels, shops, all sorts of businesses, both legal and illegal businesses. Often when you go to an archaeological site, you think about the structures, but the spaces in between can be really important. So crop fields on plantations or farms, but those field spaces are also really important for understanding an archaeological landscape or an archaeological site. Shipwrecks, of course, in Florida, we have a lot of those, but their connection to ports, lighthouses, forts, battlefields, outposts, any kind of military installation, camps, but also, again, those connecting sites. So roads, trails, trolley lines, railroads, all of those things are also archaeological sites. And then, of course, sacred sites, places with religious or sacred meanings, churches, those types of sites as well. So we go through all of human history because that's what anthropologists like to do and think about all the places people lived, they worshipped, they worked, they hunted, they got food, they grew food, any of this type of stuff that they traveled, all of those are archaeological sites. Sorry. Archaeological features are probably the term least used by people outside of archaeology, but a really important one. So archaeological features are things created by people, but it's not something that you can pick up and move around. So this is your building foundation, a post hole, a trench, a borrow pit, anything that's used to construct a building. I like to think of archaeologists, we look at the bottoms of buildings, while preservationists look at everything, you know, from the bottom to the top. We usually only ever find the bottom. We also are really good at finding things below the bottom, the cellars, the subfloor pits. Of course, trash pits and middens, wells, drains, and privies are favorite things, you know, historic toilets, hearths and fire pits, grave shafts and burial pits. These are all examples of features. So they're often just different colored soils in the ground, or like what you see in this picture, you actually see burnt timbers here. This is from a Mississippian period site, mound site, actually from the Mississippi Delta, where you have burnt features and the preservation of some of the structure itself. This is actually a picture of me at my very, very first archaeological excavation at my field school about 1,000 years ago when I was in undergrad. Examples of archaeological artifacts, these are the things we're probably the most familiar with. You can see a lot behind me in my background, but these are all the little things we find, the ceramics, the buttons, the buckles, even sometimes the coins, the animal bones from people's dinners, horseshoes, glass bottles, all that good stuff that can be picked up and carried around. People like to focus on the sexy stuff, the coins, the buttons, those things, but it's often the less sexy stuff that can tell us the most important stories. Those nails, those manufactured bottles, even bricks can become really personal and tell a lot of stories. So how do we use archaeological resources? So archaeology, for a long time, people were like, oh, that's great. That can tell us about things before we had the written word. And it absolutely can. But it can also tell us a lot of about what was going on in people's life, even after we started keeping historic documents. Originally, historical archaeology, so that period of archaeology that starts really with colonialism, was thought as the handmaiden to history. It really served historic preservation in a way of we'll uncover where the foundations are in colonial Williamsburg so you can reconstruct the buildings or repair them in a certain way. But archaeology is really so much beyond that. So I wanted to focus on three things that ways archaeological resources can be used and are actively being used. One is to disrupt commonly held misconceptions and myths about the past. So this is, I think, one of the best ways we use archaeology is to disrupt those myths and misconceptions. The other way is to tell a more complete story about the past. Not everyone could read and write. Not everyone's name appears in the historic record, but everyone leaves trash behind. And by looking at their trash, which are the archaeological artifacts, we can really bring those people that are left out of the documents into the foreground. But it also allows us to ask and answer new and different questions about the past that maybe we couldn't come at in a different ways or would be harder to come at through just the documentary record or even just the standing structures. So I'm going to give you three examples from Pensacola, all of which are projects that we have either worked on in the past or are currently working on all around this area. So we'll start with myths and misconceptions. For those of you that live in the Pensacola area, you may be aware of the myth of the tunnels underneath Pensacola. I've learned that many, many cities around the world have sort of these myths of these ideas about tunnels. And this is an example of what you'll find on the internet if you Google Pensacola tunnels. We've got posts from Facebook, a 5-hour video on YouTube, which was really spurred a lot of this discussion when it came out a few years ago. Posts on Reddit that you see on the right. And then the center there is actually an Instagram post from a local journalist documenting a project that's undergoing right now in downtown Pensacola on Palafox Street, which if you've been to Pensacola, it's that sort of main drag of all the bars and restaurants through the historic Pensacola. And he has sort of jokingly put up day 9 searching for the Palafox tunnels as he's been documenting that construction that's been ongoing there. But this is a real thing. There's a lot of oral history about people saying, oh, my grandfather told me about tunnels, or I saw this. And then, of course, that growth that it has on the internet in all of these different ways. For our quite a few students that are historic guides and interpreters in our downtown historic village, one of the #1 questions they get asked these days is about these tunnels. And just to show you the impact of social media, while these oral histories or these sort of rumors have been around a long time, over 20 years ago, I had that same job working as a historic guide in downtown Pensacola, and no one ever asked me about tunnels. And they get asked almost on a daily basis about tunnels because of this social media presence. So what are we finding with the tunnels? Well, the truth is not much of anything. Some of the tunnels have been rumored to be associated with Prohibition, some even going under Pensacola Bay all the way to Fort Pickens. And if you know anything about Pensacola Bay, you know it's very deep. It's about 6 meters deep or about 20 feet deep. And the whole reason Pensacola is where it is because of that deep water bay was so attractive to first the Spanish colonists, but throughout time, even to the modern military installations, the attraction of that deep water bay. So constructing a tunnel historically under that amount of water would have been quite a challenge. So let's look at what it really looks like to dig a hole in downtown Pensacola. So this is a historic map of downtown Pensacola. You can see, I'm gonna move my little cursor. Palafox Street is the one that's currently undergoing construction, runs right here. I am currently sitting right over here, which would have been in the water during the historic period, but we've made land since then. But right in this area, right by, if you're ever in Pensacola, in what we call Museum Plaza, was the center of first a Spanish fort and then later a British colonial fort and then again a Spanish fort throughout the 1700s of Pensacola. And right in the middle of what we call Museum Plaza today is what was once the commanding officer's compound. So I wanted to show you all this, even though we excavated the majority of this in about 2005 and 2006 with some earlier excavations predating that in the 90s. We're still processing some of the artifacts even today. But I wanted to show you this because I wanted to show you the challenge of digging in a hole that would make tunnels like this an engineering marvel. So this is some of our excavations from 2005, right in that center area, about a block from Palafox Street, 2 blocks from Palafox Street. And what you might notice are these white holes going into the ground. And what those are well points attached to this big pump here, actively pumping out water from the ground. Because at this level of depth here, the water was filling in so much that we could not excavate. What you're also seeing here is that those layers of Pensacola history. So on the top here, these brick features are cooking hearths associated with that British occupation of Florida. So that 18 years of the British occupying Florida prior to the American Revolution. And then underneath that, you're seeing some earlier features from the previous Spanish occupation. This is the top of a barrel well here. And then over to the right-hand side, that sort of rectangular shaped feature is an underground cooler. Now, one of the things you might notice about this is in the cooler itself, you can see there's wood preservation, and you'll start to see that there's also wood preservation in this barrel, meaning that that has sat in water since the 1700s. And you may also notice that that's just a couple feet below the surface of the ground. And if you, on our past picture, the main street here is the historic shoreline, the historic water line. So it would have been, the water would have been even closer in the past. So let's look a little further. This is another angle, again, showing those pumps going into both those features, that underground cooler over here, and this barrel well. What you might be noticing about this barrel well is we have staves sticking out of the wall above it. This, the kind of orangish rust color is the barrel bands. The light color in between is literally sand just between those bands. But as it starts to get dark underneath, that's the actual wood of the barrel. This is an angle that you can see, and you might notice some funny things about these pictures that I wanted to include. Here's again the wood preservation. And the wood preservation was so good, you could actually see the carvings into that barrel of the shipping marks and the contents, and including the bung of the barrel was preserved. You may also notice I'm not wearing any shoes here. That is because of the softness of the sand. This sand is so soft and so crumbly that we didn't wear shoes because it would churn up the ground so much when we're trying to keep it flat. What you might notice in this picture is the standing water around the barrel. So even though we have these big well points going in and pumping out the water, water was still coming in. And this cord that you kind of see wrapped around that and wrapped around here is actually connected to a sump pump that we were constantly turning on and off to get the water out so we could excavate out that barrel. My advice to you is always pay attention whether or not you're standing in a puddle when you plug and unplug a sump pump, because I did not pay attention and made that mistake and shocked myself once or twice in that process. But look at that. What you see here is an archaeologist's nightmare in some ways. This is a full wall collapse. This is where the barrel was. In our efforts to try to get the barrel out, we thought a barrel well, usually they knock out the top and bottom of the barrels, stack them on top of each other in the hole that's dug, and use the barrels themselves to just make the shaft of the hole. What we found was when we got to the bottom of that barrel is it had a bottom. Not a solid bottom, but a solid bottom that holes had been dug into it. And those holes were used as a water filtration system because all of this is sitting on top of kind of an ancient swamp that would have made the water get little black things in it. So we thought we were going to be able to just pull the staves. We ended up having to pull the whole barrel. This collapses the wall. You can see how delicate all of this sand is when you move stuff. So again, the idea of building an underground tunnel about 200 years ago in that sand, in that water, seems really impractical and really difficult, not to mention actually traveling under, again, over 20 feet of water in Pensacola Bay. There was a couple things that were really exciting about this. One was, of course, the preservation of the wood. But two was I had been promised as a young grad student that we would find the barrel full of stuff, that old barrels were used as trash pits. Well, this one they filled in, and the only thing we found in it was what I'm holding on this tray, which was a smashed up metal pail. So the bucket for pulling the water out was the only thing in the bottom of that barrel. In the giant cooler, the only thing we found was one wine bottle. So again, kind of looking at these things of where does the myth, the misconception of the past come from with the sort of the practicality of the archaeology, but also if we're spending so much time kind of exploring these misconceptions of the past, is it taking up space where we could be telling other stories? So talking about telling other stories, a more complete story, this is a brand new project we're just beginning the work on. So this is a shot of Pensacola's Navy Yard, which is located out at NAS Pensacola, the Naval Air Station in Pensacola. So if you've, of course, visited Pensacola, that's where you would go to the Naval Air Museum. And this is where the Blue Angels are stationed. This is, in a lot of ways, the heart of Pensacola. So much of our business is connected to the Navy. Well, this big empty field that we're walking around in here is where the original buildings for the Navy Yard were constructed in the 1820s. So we'll look a little bit. This is the original plan map from 1826 of what the Navy Yard would be built as. Up here you see, this is what today is the Admiral's house, but the Commandant's house, some other housing. And then you have these kind of temporary structures, housing built for workers, brick ovens, and they were all labeled, which is really helpful. And one of the things that we found really interesting is there's a frame house structure that was temporarily built for yard laborers. And then right behind it is labeled a brick oven for Black laborers. And we know that the majority of the Navy Yard, the laborers themselves were enslaved laborers that were rented for their labor to be used by the federal government, bringing in enslaved people locally, but also from as far away as Tallahassee. So our goal here is to uncover a deeper understanding of the history of the Navy Yard, which is this year celebrating, the Naval Air Station celebrating its 200th anniversary, because it started as this Navy Yard, by telling the story of those enslaved workers that really built the first Navy Yard that this can be credited to. Now, in the historic documents for the original group that came out, there is one reference just referring to a gentleman in Tallahassee that is bringing his enslaved workers to do this work. So no names, not of the enslaved people, nor even of the quote unquote gentleman from Tallahassee. But they do show up in other ways. This is a map from the 1830s. Those temporary structures are gone. You may notice these hexagonal shaped structures. This hexagon shaped structure is this hexagon shaped structure today. And up here in this top corner up here, we have another indication that there's it's described as the quote unquote Negro housing. So again, housing for enslaved laborers that were brought in specifically to construct and do the work at the Navy Yard. Again, not having a lot of names, not having a lot of interpretation. And what we see on the ground today here is a big empty open field. So we went out into that big empty open field and started probing, and we got very excited because we put our probe, you can see this is Elizabeth White in the center here with the probe. She is a graduate student at UWF, and this is going to be her master's thesis. She's probing down, she gets the probe all the way in, we're excited, we don't hit anything. Well, we later learned that there's actually a concrete foundation under about 2.5 feet, 3 feet of fill there from a hangar that had been put in the 20th century. But that, while it covers these original houses here from the 1820s, it does not cover the ones from the 1830s. So in fact, next week, on Monday, I believe, we are going to go out and run a ground penetrating radar survey over these areas to see if we can locate these buildings. A previous ground penetrating radar survey has located the two buildings on the blue circled building here, and then some of these red circled buildings here on this map. So we're really, really hopeful. The area is clear. It is sandy soil. We're really excited that we think the GPR is going to point us in a great direction. And then we plan to start excavating some of these living areas in the summer, later this summer. And so what we're going to be looking for is, how do you find evidence of enslaved people when these are enslaved primarily men who are being brought in temporarily, most likely living in sort of barrack style housing. They're being brought in from other locations, so they're probably not able to bring a lot of personal items with them if they even if they had them. So how do you find those individuals? So we started looking at other sites of enslavement to kind of get an idea of what we might look for beyond just the buildings themselves. So I'll give you a couple examples of the kinds of artifacts we might be looking for. One, of course, is something incredibly personal like this. So this is not from Florida. This is actually from Virginia. This is a ring made of carnelian. It's a finger ring that we recovered at James Madison's Montpelier in Orange, Virginia, but not from the Madison's house, but from a building that was used as a kitchen and a quarter, an enslaved quarter in the 1800s. Now, this ring is incredibly unique. The material that it's made of, carnelian, is a stone that comes primarily from India, but also from Pakistan and that sort of part of the world. It is very rarely found in the United States, or even really in the Western Hemisphere in an archaeological context. It was so rare that when we first uncovered it, no one on our staff had seen it except for our supervisor, who had seen a bead one time while doing work in Jamaica. Now you can buy carnelian today. It's not a particularly precious stone, but it was heavily traded out of India and into East Africa and then across the African continent, but didn't have a trade really into the Western Hemisphere for jewelry or beads. So finding this carnelian ring in this early 19th century context was really unique, and particularly in enslaved context. We did testing on it to source the origin of the carnelian and how it was made. It's the size of probably a woman's size 6, so it's a woman's finger ring. And as we started kind of putting all this together, how would this ring have gotten there? And we looked at other examples. We had in nearby Manassas, Virginia, a finger ring made of ebony. So an African source material had been found in a contemporaneous kitchen quarter building that the archaeologists there had argued that the enslaved people had brought with them when they were taken from Africa and then eventually lost in that kitchen quarter. The carnelian beads that had been found in Jamaica had been found in burials of enslaved Africans, Afro-Jamaicans. So we really saw this as things that had been brought by enslaved individuals, and they were able to hide either on their body, in their hair, or because it's so small, and then pass down through their family and really treated quite special. We were then able to kind of take all this evidence that we had gathered archaeologically through these comparative collections, but as well as this, sourcing of the carnelian itself, and talk to the descendant community, including a woman named Betty Kearse. Betty is a direct descendant of enslaved folks at James Madison's Montpelier, and according to her family's oral history, a direct descendant of the Madisons as well, and of James Madison. Now, her ancestor, Betty, serves as her family's griot and has written a book called The Other Madisons that I highly recommend, about her family's history and her uncovering of that. But in her family's oral history, they tell the story of an enslaved woman named Mandy, who was captured from West Africa, from Ghana, brought over, sold to James Madison Sr., who was the father of James Madison, the president. She was then sexually assaulted and gave birth to a child named Corinne, who worked as a cook for the Madisons, who was also sexually assaulted and had children on down, leading eventually to Betty and her line, and her relatives. The tie between the story of Betty's family and the story we had sort of constructed archaeologically with this ring was really incredible, not only because of those connections to coming from Africa, working as enslaved cooks, living in these spaces, the time all lining up, but also in her family's oral history, they had a story of Mandy actually bringing with her from Ghana a red bead so that she was able to smuggle something out with her. It was red, which is very similar to the color of this ring, but a bead. So her oral history and what we were able to kind of reconstruct archaeologically were really similar. So we're going to look for these kinds of things when we're looking out at the Navy Yard, of these little personal items, and maybe not coming all the way from Africa, but these personal items that someone may be able to bring with them to remind them of home, of Tallahassee, of these particular events. We're also going to look for something that's completely, in many ways, very impersonal, but also has a personal collection, something like this. So this is a handmade brick. We know they would have been making lots of bricks as part of the construction of the Navy Yard. This brick itself is really unique. Again, this is one from Montpelier because we haven't started these excavations yet. We've only done ground penetrating radar on some of the area and are doing more immediately. But this brick is unique for two reasons. One, it has this number hand carved in it, 74, and two, a fingerprint right here. Bricks are amazing because they often have the fingerprints of the person that made them. And so this is a very direct and personal way to connect to particularly enslaved laborers from the 17 and 1800s. The 74 is the quota, the amount of bricks the person would have been making. So keeping track. So we have one set of bricks that has these numbers in it. Most of them don't. But we have quite a few with these fingerprints in them. And that becomes an incredibly personal thing. You get an idea of what is the size of this person's hand. How can I connect with them? On plantations, bricks were often made by children. But looking at a site like this where it's going to be primarily made by adult laborers. So the last kind of area that we're thinking about is how do we ask and answer new questions? And as a former curator, this is one of my favorite things to do, is to look at old collections, old sites, and ask and answer new questions. You know, we always think of archaeology as digging. If we put a shovel in the ground, we can ask a new question, we can answer a new question, but a lot of times we can look at the past. So this, what you're seeing here, is from the Hawkshaw site. So this was excavated in the 1980s, if you couldn't tell by her archaeological outfit right here. But this was the first public archaeology site ever done in Pensacola. So in the 1980s, Dr. Judy Benz struck up a deal with what was then Gulf Power, now Florida Power and Light. They were putting in a large building just down the street in the other direction from us, and weren't getting a lot of good press about it. So what Dr. Benz was able to do was to go in and not only do amazing archaeology, but turn the community really in support of this project by thinking outside the box. So you can see the archaeology happening here. They uncovered a Deptford site, so a middle woodland period site that had amazing context, but also there were occupation levels from the colonial period, and then later into the 19th century and early 20th century. And they really thought outside the box. There was traditional archaeological questions of what is here, who lived here, what did they eat, where did they live? But then they started doing these other ways to engage the public. This is a page over here from a coloring book or a public children's book that was produced. To the left, you see an exhibit case. Exhibits were installed into the Gulf Power building to tell the story of this site on the site. And really to bring the public in. A documentary was made, all of these things. Last year, one of our students, Ellen Minette, did her master's thesis re-examining the Hawkshaw site. And again, asking new questions and answering them. But she wasn't just asking questions of the archaeology itself. She was asking questions of how can we interpret this archaeology in a different way and make it relevant to the public again. It was really relevant in the 80s. In 1986, it was the first public archaeology project. 1985, 86. In 2025, we celebrated the 20th anniversary of the founding of the Florida Public Archaeology Network. So 20 years after the first public archaeology project in Pensacola, the Florida Public Archaeology Network was created and then headquartered in Pensacola. And then 20 years later, how do we look at how public archaeology has changed through time? So that's really what Ellie was looking at. part of that was because that exhibit that we saw to the left here at Gulf Power was no longer visible to the public unless you have clearance to work in that building. The Florida Power and Light building now is closed to the public. 20 years ago, it had a cafe in it. Anyone could go in and eat. They had a really great restaurant that would give you free bread pudding with any of your meals. It was a really fantastic place. Today, even many of the people that work in that building didn't know the exhibits were there because they just didn't happen to walk down that hallway. So what had previously been a very public product was no longer visible to the public. So Ellie went about it in a new way. In the middle here, this middle picture, you see she created a new exhibit where she took objects from that Gulf Power exhibit, Florida Power and Light exhibit, brought them, put them on display in downtown Pensacola at the FPAN office in our museum. And then some of them have since moved to the UWF campus, to the Archaeology Institute to go on display there. So 2 different physical exhibitions to bring that out in a new way. She also, I'm gonna click on some things here to show you. She also did 3D scans of many of these artifacts. So now they can be seen digitally in 3 dimensions through Sketchfab and through our website. So this is an example. So even if you're not in Pensacola, you can see these artifacts. Originally, Hawkshaw, they had created a VHS video. Ellie started making social media videos. So I'm gonna see if I can click on this. I'm gonna bring it over and
I'm a graduate student at the University of West Florida, as well as a graduate assistant at the Florida Public Archaeology Network. Today, I am installing an exhibit on the Hawkshaw Project. This is part of my thesis research. The Hawkshaw Project was an excavation done in downtown Pensacola in 1984 and 1985. Dr. Judy Bentz and a team of local volunteers, as well as students at UWF, excavated the site of the now Florida Power and Light headquarters building. It was then Gulf Power. In this excavation, they ended up with lots of artifacts that were really incredible, including a very important Deptford deposit, and you will see some of those artifacts behind me. These artifacts went on exhibit at the Florida Power and Light building in the 80s and stayed there for the last 40 years. So my project is bringing these artifacts back to light. We are bringing them back to the public. We just closed an exhibit at the Destination Archaeology Center downtown, and these artifacts, as well as the exhibit with all the panels and information, have now moved up to the Archaeology Institute at the University of West Florida, so that they will be on display and available for the public to come and enjoy them.
so you can see, again, giving new light to these things, asking and answering different questions. She also created a digital exhibit. Part of it is under construction right now, but there's some cool things that I hopefully will load and I can show you here, including a game that is an interactive museum game where you can enter a virtual museum and travel through, ask and answer questions about, can you help us put Hawkshaw back together? Yes. And you can move through all of these different spaces. And as you move through, it populates your exhibit. So we got that one right. And then you can zoom in and see the images. So really thinking about how do we do public archaeology differently 40 years after it first came to Pensacola. So there are some sites that do it all, and honestly, most archaeology sites can do all of these things, disrupt myths, tell more complete story of the past, and ask and answer new questions. But I think they wouldn't let me be an archaeologist in Pensacola if I did not talk about the Luna sites. So in 1559, Pensacola was first permanently settled by a guy with the name of Tristan de Luna, colonizing Pensacola on behalf of Spain, so the first settlement of European origins. They had a lot of problems, mainly hurricanes, and that settlement only lasted about 3 years, but the hurricanes, while detrimental to the settlement, were fantastic for producing archaeological sites. So we have 3 identified shipwrecks associated with Luna's fleet, plus the land site. And what you're seeing here are images from all of these things. So one of the things that I think is really interesting is while the first shipwreck, the first Emmanuel Point wreck was first discovered in the 90s, the Emmanuel Point 2 was discovered in the early 2000s when I was a graduate student at UWF, and then the Emmanuel Point 3 more recently, and the land site more recently as well. We're continuing to be able to ask and answer questions both from the new discoveries, the new excavations, but also from things we've already had. So one great example of this, of the site that does it all, is these amazing animal bones that have come out, particularly of the shipwreck sites. So the preservation of these shipwreck sites, because they're in almost zero visibility and a really silty layer, has been fantastic. So everything from cockroach wings to which you see here, one of the earliest black rat in all of North America to be discovered, as you see here, is the big almost complete skeleton. This bone here, which is a cat vertebrae, has been one of the most important bones for us understanding the site differently. So this cat bone is not that surprising to find on a shipwreck site. We think of ships as something with lots of rats, and clearly the Emmanuel Point wrecks, the Luna wrecks, had rats. We know that for sure. So we think of these cats as being ratters. So they're on the ship for a purpose. Often when we look at the past, we're always trying to give a really practical answer for something. Ships had rats, so ships had cats, cats kill rats, everybody's happy. But under recent analysis of these bones, under the guidance of Dr. John Bratton at the University of West Florida, what they were able to determine is that the diet of this cat was not rats. It actually would have more closely reflected the diet of the sailors and the soldiers that were part of the Luna expedition. This cat was a pet, which is really exciting because that is something that is really important to so many of us today. Our everyday life, our pets, we talk about them all the time. But we often forget that people, number one, in the past had pets, that it wasn't just using animals for practical purposes. So that's sort of a myth or a misconception of the past that we have. It helps us tell a more complete story of the past in that it adds a layer of humanity to these soldiers, these settlers, these sailors that all came over. It's not just about, conquest and colonization. There is this sort of everyday life, and part of everyday life is feeding your animal the treats that it likes to eat. The other part of this is that it allows us to, again, ask and answer new questions without requiring new excavation. So looking at what we already have and thinking about it in a different way. Are there other pets that we need to look at? Are there other misconceptions that we have about the past? Are there other new technologies like having 3D scanning and photogrammetry so available and websites so available that we can use to ask and answer new questions that we didn't have 20 years ago, 40 years ago, 60 years ago? So this is, I think, just a really lovely example. And that picture at the bottom of the cute cat is from a cover of a book called Luna the Cat, which is a children's book that Mike Toman, who's one of our Afghan employees, co-authored with Nicole Brennan from the Archaeology Institute. So you can buy that at your local bookstore. So that's kind of my spiel of what archaeology can do, what archaeological resources can do. I'm happy to answer any questions. And for those of you around the state of Florida, I know I talked a lot about Pensacola, but be sure to also reach out to your local FPAN offices. We are all over the state, and we are always happy to talk about archaeology with you some more. So thank you. I'm going to stop my share.
Thank you, Mary. That was a great presentation, and I love seeing all those things in Pensacola again. It's been a while since I've been there. Yes, we are going to go ahead and answer questions now. And if you do have a question, feel free to mute yourself and we can call you to ask your question. We do have one question in the chat so far that I'll go ahead and ask. Speaking of the internet and the validity of the content posted, what do you suggest we do to counteract these misconceptions?
I think, we're already losing this battle, right? because we're all trying to counteract it as part of our job. And the people that are producing it, it's often their full-time job. So I think for a long time, particularly when social media first came out, we we're all like, okay, I guess we'll do that. We'll just put an intern on it, a student on it. Let them run an Instagram account or a Facebook account. But we really need to think about digital communication with the level of importance that we do every other thing of our job. So not just pushing it on to whoever your intern is, but really investing in it in a way, because this is where, this is where most people get their news and their information. So producing good quality content is one of the best things we can do. Having someone on your team that understands that it's not just getting stuff out there, but it's how you use these algorithms, what tools can make this process easier, how to use social media management tools are really important. One of the things that we did here, because I work at the University of West Florida, is they actually have a communications class both at a graduate and an undergraduate levels that focus in on social media. And they use a client model, and they took FPAN on as a client to give us feedback of what was working, what didn't work, and what little things we could do to improve until we got to the point where it really could be someone's full-time job. And I know for many of us that work at historic sites or in agencies that are like, oh, we're so underfunded, we can barely do what we need to do now. I think that is all very true, but it is also part of our growth mentality. It is a way to get new audiences to come visit our sites. It's a way to get people interested. I wouldn't say spending a lot of time in the comments arguing with people is helpful for anyone, and it's really not. The other thing that's really great is so many of us have really wonderful volunteers that we work with on a regular basis. All of them have social media. So really asking them to not only share your content, but let them be the ones that fight the battles for you. A lot of them love to be on Facebook already. Let them be the one to respond. Don't feel like you have to counter every comment or all of the negative content that's out there. Some of you may be well aware there's some people that have really active YouTube pages on everything from Atlantis being in the Gulf of Mexico to these tunnels. One of the things that we have found from them, what they want from us is legitimacy. They want us to share their content. So number one, don't share their content. Realize that they probably already have more followers than you do. So really focusing on building your content and your audience, I think is really important, and realizing that they're experts and reaching out to those experts, not just to whatever student walks into your office, because a lot of times students don't know any more than you do.
Thank you. And I appreciate that response, especially from your background with public archaeology. I think that's really helpful, and something to consider, because I know there are times when I even am looking at comments and the first thing you want to do is try to argue, but at the same time, is it going to be helpful? Not necessarily. But I think it's a really great idea to post content that is correct, accurate, fun still, so that people are interested in that.
Especially if you don't work for the state of Florida and can get on TikTok. If you work for the state government, we cannot have TikTok accounts. It's against the law. But if you work for a nonprofit, you can use TikTok, and that is a really great place to be. That's a really good space.
Let's see. Does anyone have any questions in the virtual audience? We do have one more in the chat, but I'll give some time for anyone in the audience.
Yeah. Let's see. In the chat. Do you want to start answering the one in the chat, or?
Yeah, I can go ahead and read that off if that's fine. Is there a website that lists all of the archaeological opportunities going on in Florida, particularly in the Tampa area?
So if you go to FPAN's website, which is fpan.us, you can see we have an events page, and you can search it by region. So your region is Tampa area is the West Central region. We actually have an FPAN office at the University of South Florida that serves your region. There's always programs going on around there, particularly out at the Weeden Island site. They take volunteers in their lab there. if you're looking for a hands-on experience, if you're just looking for talks and things like that. So going to FPAN's website is a really great place to find all the events, projects, opportunities that we have going on. Now, is that every archaeology organization in the state? No, but we work really closely with most of them. The other would be the Florida Anthropological Society, FAS. They have chapters around the state, including one in Tampa. I think they're Time Sifters is their name, in that area, where they usually have monthly meetings, and they can do everything from provide volunteer opportunities to doing like a monthly lecture series. So those would be the first two places I would look. But particularly getting involved and finding things in your area, FPAN has it set up on a map pretty easily.
And on the Florida Trust side, we actually have regional councils. So that can also be found on the Florida Trust website. And each of those regional councils often will have a newsletter or an email or post different events in the area that you could be involved with historic preservation in general. Let's see. Anyone in the audience have any questions? How can we get more information about cemetery preservation?
That was me. And I said that because that's a question that we get a lot. And I think with our conference coming up, it's something we've heard about a lot. So you have a historic cemetery in your community. What is some things that maybe FPAN can do or that you could do individually to kind of help get that preservation in motion?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things that you can do is one of the things that FPAN provides is what we call our crypt training, which is our cemetery resource protection training, which is like a 1 day, 1.5 day training event where we can come to you, whether you have a particular cemetery in mind or kind of cemeteries in your area, and we will give you the full rundown of everything from the laws to actually how to clean and protect the headstones in your cemetery. So that is a really active training program that we have going on right now. And we do them all over the state, and we often kind of don't just have them open and you sign up. We get contacted by a group that wants one of these. So if you have a local community organization, we are happy to do those for you. We just recently had our crypt conference, which we do every other year, which is where we get everybody that's taken these trainings or is working in historic cemeteries together to present on it and then visit a historic cemetery. So we just had that in Monticello, right outside of Tallahassee, in February. The other thing with cemetery work is making sure your historic cemetery is recorded, that it's listed on the Florida Master Site File and the historic registry. Let's see if I have a card. We actually have these little postcards, and then we also have a link on our website, on the FPAN website, which is just a really short form that you can fill out and say, hey, this cemetery, I'm not sure if it's listed, but I want to make sure it is. It's not a full Florida Master Site File form. It's a very abbreviated form, and that goes to us as well as the Department of Historic Resources. And what's really great about that is, one, if the cemetery's never been recorded, it allows us to get it recorded and on that list. It becomes on the state's radar, so then it can be protected, because it can't be protected in many ways unless the state knows about it and it's on their list. Number two, if it is already on their list, it's great. It lets the state know, it lets FPAN know, hey, someone's paying attention to this, someone cares about this place, they want to get involved. Maybe this is some place where we could do something like a crypt or focus on. And three, sometimes the cemetery is recorded, but they have a different name for it. So a lot of times cemeteries are called different things by different people and different things through time. So by reporting that stuff in, you're actually, if you say, well, we call this Magnolia and somebody else calls it Friedman's or something along those lines, that helps expand the story and really helps contribute to telling that more complete story. So filling out those cards or that online form really it's a really small step that has a huge impact in the long run. It also, if you put your contact information on that, it allows us to get back to you and kind of say, what are you seeing in this site? The other component we also have through FPAN is our HMS program, our Heritage Monitoring Scouts program. And this is a program where we actually can train you as members of the public to go out to historic and archaeological sites and monitor them for impact. So this could be historic cemeteries, of course, those are some of the easiest and best ones to go to, but also it could be historic standing structures, but also archaeological sites. So we have now, we used to do that program in person, but we now have put it completely online. So it's an online program. You can do it at your own pace whenever you want. Altogether, it takes about 5 hours. I wouldn't recommend doing it in one 5-hour sitting, but you could. It's mostly watching videos and then responding to them. And you become part of our scouts, our network, and then you can go out to these sites either with FPN staff or on your own and monitor them for everything from environmental impacts, like a big hurricane comes through, how has this site been impacted, to what we just recently had in Pensacola on Saturday. We had a car drive into our historic cemetery here in Pensacola, St. Michael's Cemetery. This is like the 3rd or 4th car in 3 years. So that's a major impact to the site. And so going out and reporting that is really helpful for the preservation of these sites, cemeteries in particular, but we do it at all different types of sites. So that's a really great way to get involved is through HMS. And even if you feel like you're never going to go to those sites, the course itself is fantastic. You'll learn a ton and you can go back and visit it anytime to get those resources, which is really nice.
Okay, I'm going to mention the one last question from the chat, and it's basically about the 3D imaging of artifacts. Does FPAN hold workshops to teach people how to do 3D recording for independent projects, and to piggyback on the cemeteries specifically to incorporate 3D scanning of grave artifacts? And how can people use their own phones and things like that? Or can they?
So FPAN's done a couple of things. One, we do have a 3D terrestrial laser scanner. It's quite expensive. We'll show people how to use that. We'll use it on sites. I don't recommend anyone buying one because they're quite expensive, and really you can use your cell phone and do photogrammetry, quite affordable to get those 3D digital images. We have done photogrammetry workshops in the past. It's not kind of our regularly standing ones like these crypt or HMS ones, but if that is something that you're really interested in, if that's something that you really want, we could certainly set something up for you and your group. Or if, for example, if we were doing a crypt for you, we could tack it on as a special module. You're like, I already know how to scrub a headstone. I want to know how to 3D do some photogrammetry. There's quite a bit of stuff that's available online about how to do it, but really there are some free to low cost apps you can get on your iPhone, and it will help stitch it together, and you can really start producing 3D models quite quickly. I would just always say is, why do you want them? What is the story that you're telling? What's the need for them? The example that I showed you with the artifacts from Hawkshaw, it was because these artifacts aren't available to be seen in really any other way, was one of the desires to have them available online and have this digital exhibition. For cemeteries, if your cemetery is inaccessible, like physically it's really hard to get to and the community wants to be able to see it, or are you doing these as a way of documenting the headstones? Maybe if you're a place that it's a hurricane magnet and your headstones are getting knocked over all the time, or as in the case of St. Michael's, a vehicle magnet where cars are crashing into all the time, then it might make sense as a preservation component, but really thinking about why do you need it? Where would it live afterwards? Ours live, we put them up on Sketchfab, which then makes them available to anyone online, but also means that they can be used for other purposes because Sketchfab is owned by like a video game designer. So your 3D scans could end up in a video game as part of that process. So that's also thinking about some of those things. So anytime with technology, I always, before we get so excited of how cool it is, always think about why you want to do it.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you, Mary, for spending lunch with us today and answering our questions. To everyone who joined us today, thank you so much. We hope you enjoyed the presentations. And if for some reason we could not get to your question, please reach out and we will try to find that answer for you and get back to you. If you or your company is interested in sponsoring a future Lunch and Learn, please email Laura Glenn of the Florida Trust. Her contact information will be added to the chat now. If you're not already a member of the Florida Trust, please consider joining today for access to free webinars and many other great benefits, like our newly relaunched Preservation Passport program. We hope you can join us next month in April for our next Lunch and Learn. Stay tuned for our newsletter, website, and socials for more information coming soon. FYI, all registrants for today's Lunch and Learn will receive a follow-up email in the coming days with the link to today's video, the presentation material, and any other additional handouts and resources. Thank you again for joining us today, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Bye.